June 23, 1942. The wind along the Welsh coast carried the smell of sea salt as Royal Air Force spotters at RAF Pembrey raised their binoculars. Through the drifting clouds, a lone fighter approached, sleek, powerful, and unmistakably German. But something was off. The aircraft wasn't diving in attack. It was setting up for a textbook landing. No sirens, no anti-aircraft fire, only stunned silence as the Focke-Wulf 190 glided onto the grass and rolled to a stop as if it belonged there. The engine sputtered to silence. The canopy slid open. Out climbed a young Luftwaffe pilot, confident stride, leather helmet under his arm, until he noticed something that froze the blood in his veins. The aircraft scattered across the flight line weren't Messerschmitts. They were Spitfires. The uniforms sprinting toward him weren't gray. They were RAF blue. In less than a second, Oberleutnant Armin Faber understood the impossible. He had landed in Britain. For months, the Allies had been desperate to study this machine. The Focke-Wulf 190 had arrived over France like a thunderbolt in 1941. It outrolled, outclimbed, outgunned, and outdove nearly anything the RAF could field. Veteran pilots whispered about the mysterious new fighter with a mixture of fear and awe. No downed wreck had ever been intact enough to analyze. Now, by sheer accident, Britain had acquired a pristine specimen delivered straight to its doorstep. As armed RAF men surrounded Faber and escorted him away, senior officers were already sending frantic signals to headquarters. Fighter Command's leadership realized immediately what had landed in their laps. Within hours, the aircraft was cordoned off. Within a day, it was on its way to the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough. A weapon that had haunted Allied skies for 8 months was finally in their hands. But when British test pilots climbed into the cockpit and fired up the engine, they discovered something far more shocking than expected, details that would rewrite Allied air tactics. Within 48 hours of its accidental delivery, the captured FW-190 sat inside a secure hangar at the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough. Britain's top aviation engineers circled it like surgeons around a rare specimen. They measured every control surface, traced every hydraulic line, and documented every bolt. This wasn't just a fighter, they quickly realized it was a brutally efficient piece of combat engineering. The first surprise was the engine. The BMW 801 radial power plant roared with nearly 1,700 horsepower, a muscular beast that dwarfed the output of the Spitfire MKV's Merlin engine. But raw power wasn't what stunned the British. It was responsiveness. The throttle felt like it was wired directly to the pilot's instincts. Smooth, immediate, almost unnervingly alive. Then came the roll rate. Captain Eric Brown, one of the most skilled test pilots Britain had, took the aircraft up for its first evaluation flight. When he banked left and snapped right, the FW-190 responded with a ferocity that startled even him. The aircraft rotated as if pivoting on an invisible axis. Brown later remarked, "It felt like the aircraft obeyed thought more than touch." The firepower was equally jarring. For 20mm cannons and 2 machine guns, mounted tightly near the fuselage, could unleash a burst so dense and concentrated that a single 1-second volley could shred a Spitfire. Engineers ran ballistic simulations and were astonished. This gun layout wasn't just lethal. It was designed to devastate. Every test confirmed the same unsettling truth. The FW-190 wasn't an evolution of German design. It was a leap. For months, Allied pilots weren't losing because of tactics or training. They were losing because their aircraft simply couldn't match the FW-190's low-altitude performance. But as Farnborough's engineers dug deeper, one revelation after another exposed weaknesses just as significant as its strengths. The FW-190's strengths explained the Allies' losses. But what British test pilots uncovered next were flaws so critical they would reshape all future engagements. As Farnborough's engineers pushed beyond the initial tests, they reached the altitude envelope, an area where the FW-190 had always seemed invincible to Allied pilots. But the truth revealed itself quickly. Above 20,000 feet, the aircraft's confidence evaporated. The BMW 801 radial engine, so dominant at low and medium altitudes, began to gasp in the thinning air. Power dropped sharply, engine temperatures spiked, and climb rates suffered. The Spitfire, ironically, showed its greatest strength here. Its Merlin engine, designed with high-altitude supercharging, thrived where the FW-190 struggled. In tests, British pilots discovered they could simply climb away from the German fighter, forcing it into a vertical chase it couldn't sustain. For the first time in months, the RAF had found a reliable counter. Take the fight up. Then came a discovery even more surprising, one that contradicted everything Allied pilots had reported during frantic dogfights. At high speeds, especially in steep dives, the FW-190's controls became frighteningly heavy. The ailerons, normally feather-light, stiffened as though they were fighting the pilot. The elevator became sluggish. Pulling out of a high-speed dive required physical strength bordering on brute force. This weakness provided a rare and dangerous but real tactical opening. If an Allied pilot could push the FW-190 into a prolonged dive and stay close enough to follow through the initial descent, the German aircraft would hit a vulnerable moment, precisely during the pullout. When its controls stiffened and the pilot fought to level out, a pursuing Spitfire or P-47 could get a clean firing solution. But perhaps the most important flaw revealed wasn't aerodynamic, it was psychological. Pilots had given the FW-190 a mythic reputation. Unbeatable, uncatchable, unstoppable. The Farnborough tests shattered that myth. With concrete data, British tacticians now understood the fighter's performance boundaries. The terror that had gripped Allied squadrons began to ease, replaced by confidence and a plan. Word of the captured aircraft spread across the Atlantic, and soon, American pilots would arrive to test the FW-190 themselves, leading to a revelation that reshaped U.S. fighter doctrine. By late summer 1942, the news had reached American ears. Britain possessed a fully intact FW-190. To the U.S. Army Air Forces, this wasn't just interesting, it was revolutionary. The Luftwaffe's newest Predator had already earned a fearsome reputation among RAF squadrons, and American fighter groups preparing to deploy to Europe needed answers. So, in August, a select group of U.S. test pilots arrived at Farnborough, eager to put Germany's lethal machine through its paces. The Americans approached the aircraft with a mix of respect and curiosity. Many had heard the rumors: Spitfires cut down in seconds, RAF veterans warning younger pilots not to engage low. The FW-190 had become a whispered monster in aircrews' mess halls. Yet now, here it sat, silent and motionless, open to examination. Major Cass Hovey was among the first Americans to strap himself into the cockpit. His assessment would soon ripple through every American fighter unit. Hovey's initial report echoed the British findings. The roll rate was extraordinary, the responsiveness unmatched. At low altitudes, the FW-190 could dictate the rhythm of a fight with alarming ease. But what truly mattered to American pilots was this. Above 25,000 feet, the tables turned. The radial engine wheezed. The controls dulled. The fighter lost its claws. And for the high-altitude American escort doctrine, this was critical knowledge. Hovey's tactical conclusion was blunt enough to be unforgettable. The FW-190 owns the fight below 20,000 feet. We own it above 25. This single sentence spread like wildfire through American fighter groups. The doctrine shifted. Pilots were trained to climb, to stay high, to force German fighters into the thin air where the FW-190 faltered. Instead of dueling on German terms, they would dictate the arena. By the time P-47 Thunderbolts began escorting bombers over Europe in 1943, they carried this knowledge with them. They fought from above, dove with advantage, and refused combat at low altitude unless absolutely necessary. The FW-190 still delivered surprises, but its aura of invincibility had been broken. Data had replaced fear, and tactics were now sculpted around the enemy's exposed weaknesses. But America didn't just change tactics, they changed designs. What engineers discovered in the FW-190 would quietly influence the next generation of Allied fighters. When the captured FW-190 was finally stripped down and documented, Allied engineers realized they weren't just looking at a fighter, they were looking at a blueprint for the future. The Germans had built the aircraft with ruthless practicality. Tight systems integration, efficient layout, and a cockpit designed around the pilot, not the factory floor. American and British engineers took notes, literally. Every component was sketched, measured, and compared against their own designs. One revelation stood out: the FW-190's control harmony. Its ailerons and elevators reacted with near-instant precision at medium speeds. American engineers studying the aircraft realized their own fighters, especially the early P-47 and P-51 prototypes, needed improved roll authority. Within months, new aileron designs and control balance tweaks were introduced. These weren't direct copies, but rather evolutions inspired by studying how Germany had optimized responsiveness. The FW-190 also influenced weapons philosophy. Its 4 20mm cannons and 2 machine guns weren't just powerful, they were efficient. The guns were mounted close to the fuselage, concentrated for maximum impact. American designers took note. Later P-47 and P-51 variants tightened their gun dispersion patterns and improved harmonization, ensuring that more bullets converged where a pilot actually aimed, not scattered loosely across the sky. Even the cockpit layout left an impression. German designers had arranged switches, gauges, and levers around the pilot's workflow. The goal was simple: reduce cognitive overload in combat. Allied engineers studying the layout began redesigning their own cockpits to be more intuitive, relocating engine controls, improving sightlines, and simplifying instrument clusters. Subtle improvements, yes, but life-saving ones. But the greatest influence wasn't mechanical, it was philosophical. The FW-190 proved that a fighter didn't need to be elegant to be deadly. It needed to be reliable, maintainable, and pilot-friendly. American designers, already pushing fast development cycles, now doubled down on practical engineering. Aircraft like the later P-47D, P-51D, and F-6F Hellcat emerged not just as powerful machines but as smartly designed tools of war, shaped partly by the lessons learned from a single mistaken landing in Wales. But the greatest influence wasn't mechanical, it was philosophical. The FW-190 proved that a fighter didn't need to be elegant to be deadly. It needed to be reliable, maintainable, and pilot-friendly. American designers, already pushing fast development cycles, now doubled down on practical engineering. Aircraft like the later P-47D, P-51D, and F-6F Hellcat emerged not just as powerful machines but as smartly designed tools of war, shaped partly by the lessons learned from a single mistaken landing in Wales. Yet all the engineering insights in the world meant nothing without the pilots who had to use them, and those pilots were about to receive tactical instructions that transformed the air war. By late 1942, the intelligence gathered from the captured FW-190 had begun filtering into RAF and USAF squadrons. Commanders issued new tactical bulletins, dense packets of diagrams, altitude charts, and maneuver notes that pilots studied with the seriousness of survival itself. What had once been a terrifying unknown was now a mapped-out enemy. And for the first time since the FW-190 appeared over France, Allied pilots had clarity. The guidelines were simple but revolutionary. First, take the fight upward. Pilots were instructed to climb aggressively whenever FW-190s appeared. High altitude meant thinner air, an environment where the BMW 801 radial engine sputtered and struggled. If German fighters wanted a duel, they had to climb to meet the Allies. And in doing so, they surrendered their greatest advantage. Second, avoid horizontal rolling contests at all costs. Previously, pilots instinctively countered a roll with another roll, maneuvering on instinct rather than data. Now they knew better. The FW-190's unmatched roll rate allowed it to snap into position faster than any Allied machine. The bulletins hammered this home. Don't follow a 190 into rolling scissors. You will lose. Instead, Spitfire and Thunderbolt pilots were trained to climb vertically or extend away using energy tactics. Third, exploit the dive recovery weakness. If an FW-190 dove away, Allied pilots were taught to pursue only long enough to force it into a high-speed pullout. At that moment, when the German pilot wrestled against stiffened controls, a Spitfire or P-47 could close in for a firing solution. What had once been a hopeless chase was now a calculated opportunity. Finally, break the myth of invincibility. RAF psychologists even contributed to the intelligence briefings, explaining how fear of the unknown had amplified pilot losses. With hard data replacing rumor, confidence began to return to Allied units. One squadron leader famously pinned a diagram of the FW-190's weaknesses on the ready room wall, telling his men, "Gentlemen, the beast bleeds." The psychological shift was real, but the true test was still ahead. As Allied pilots took this new knowledge into combat, the skies over Europe began to tell a different story. Early 1943 marked a turning point. The first Allied pilots trained under the new doctrine took to the air over occupied Europe, and the results were immediate. During the opening months of the year, P-47 squadrons escorting B-17 and B-24 bombers began engaging FW-190s at altitudes where the German fighters struggled. Luftwaffe pilots climbing to meet the Thunderbolts found their engines overheating, their controls dulling, their climb rates sinking. For the first time, the FW-190's dominance faltered. British squadrons flying the upgraded Spitfire Mk9 soon joined the fight. With improved supercharging and better high-altitude performance, the Mk9 finally met the FW-190 on equal terms. Dogfights that once ended in immediate disaster for the RAF were now prolonged contests. Pilots reported that instead of being outclassed, they could now dictate ranges, angles, and engagement timings. The FW-190 was still dangerous but no longer godlike. Combat reports reflected the change. Where earlier mission logs described hopeless chases and sudden ambushes, new ones showed measured confidence. Forced a 190 to 28,000 feet. He could not hold climb, one American pilot noted. Another RAF ace wrote, "Their advantage below the clouds is real, but above them, they seem almost mortal." The myth of the untouchable German fighter was dissolving, replaced by tactical clarity and hard-won experience. But the most telling shift came from the German side. Luftwaffe aces began noticing that Allied fighters no longer made the predictable mistakes of 1942. They refused rolling duels. They climbed instead of diving. They executed energy tactics with precision. One veteran FW-190 pilot wrote in his journal, "The Americans learned our machine. They force us high where she tires. They no longer fear us." What had been a one-sided contest was now a chess match. By late 1943, even German intelligence began to suspect something was wrong. Intercepted Allied communications hinted at detailed knowledge of FW-190 performance figures, specific details that could only come from direct examination. The Luftwaffe had spent months trying to capture a Spitfire Mk9 intact. They failed. Meanwhile, the Allies had quietly been studying Faber's perfect condition FW-190 for nearly a year. The imbalance was becoming clear. But as the Allies adapted, Germany responded. New variants of the FW-190 appeared. Sleeker, faster, deadlier. And the next evolution, the D9 Dora, would raise a new question. Could the Allies keep up? By late 1944, the Luftwaffe understood that the Allies had cracked the FW-190 secrets. Losses were mounting, and the original A-series, once the terror of the Channel front, was now outperformed at high altitude by Allied designs. Germany's answer came in the form of a new predator, the FW-190D9, known by pilots as the Dora. This sleek variant replaced the radial engine with a powerful inline Jumo 213, reshaping the fighter's nose and transforming its performance profile. The Dora was fast, astonishingly so. At medium to high altitudes, it accelerated like a thrown spear and climbed with renewed confidence. Gone were the overheating issues and the sluggish high-altitude responses. German pilots who transitioned to the D9 described it as the thoroughbred the FW-190 had always wanted to be. For the first time since 1942, the Luftwaffe fielded an aircraft that could challenge the late-war Spitfires and even the P-51 Mustang. Yet even as the Dora emerged, Allied intelligence was already a step ahead. They had spent more than a year studying Faber's captured FW-190A, understanding every design philosophy behind it. When the Dora appeared, its advantages were recognized, but so were its compromises. The long nose, while housing a powerful engine, reduced forward visibility during landing and low-speed maneuvers. The new cooling system was effective but fragile under ground fire. And while the Dora excelled at altitude, it lost some of the low-altitude brutality that had defined the earlier A-series. Combat reports confirmed the shift. In vertical maneuvers and high-speed passes, the Dora was a formidable opponent. But in turning engagements, the P-51 still held the edge. And at extreme altitudes, the new Merlin-powered Spitfire 14 could outclimb and outpace even the improved German design. The Dora was a step forward, perhaps even a leap, but not enough to reverse the tide of the air war. Still, the Dora's arrival proved something vital. Germany was aware of the leak in its technological dominance. And while they tried to plug the hole with innovation, they couldn't undo the damage. The Allies had studied their design language, understood their strengths, anticipated their choices. The intelligence advantage ceded by a single wrong landing in 1942 was now bearing strategic fruit in 1944. But the story wasn't over. The true impact of Faber's mistake would only be understood after the war, when historians calculated how one accidental landing may have saved thousands of Allied airmen. When the war finally ended, Allied analysts began sifting through mountains of combat reports, intelligence briefs, and engineering logs. Buried in those thousands of pages was a pattern so consistent it stunned even the experts. The moment the Allies gained access to Armin Faber's FW-190, everything began to change. Losses that had surged in early 1942 began to level out. Aerial engagements that once ended in disaster now turned into contests or outright victories. The seemingly unstoppable German fighter had been unmasked. Historians later calculated an astonishing figure. The intelligence gathered from that single captured fighter influenced the training of tens of thousands of Allied pilots, from RAF squadrons in Britain to P-47 and P-51 groups across the European theater. Pilots who studied the FW-190's weaknesses survived encounters that would have otherwise been fatal. Engineers redesigned aircraft with insights learned from its construction. Tacticians rewrote engagement doctrine around its vulnerabilities. Even Captain Eric Brown, Britain's most experienced test pilot and the man who flew more captured enemy aircraft than anyone else, reflected on the event with gravity. It was, he wrote, the Rosetta Stone for German fighter design. Every new Luftwaffe variant introduced afterward was compared against the one Faber delivered. When the Dora appeared in late 1944, Allied engineers already understood the design lineage behind it. They weren't guessing, they were anticipating. As for Armin Faber himself, he spent the remainder of the war interned in a Canadian POW camp, alive, uninjured, and largely unaware of the impact of his mistake. After the war, he returned to Germany and lived a quiet life until 1976. His accidental landing was initially mocked and criticized within Luftwaffe circles, but later reviews acknowledged a hard truth. Combat disorientation could happen to anyone. Faber was not incompetent, he was unlucky, and that single moment of misjudgment had consequences far beyond his own fate. The story of the captured FW-190 endures because it reveals a deeper truth about war. Superiority on the battlefield isn't just earned through better machines, braver pilots, or greater firepower. It is earned through understanding. The Allies did not defeat the FW-190 by outbuilding it or outmuscling it. They defeated it by studying it, by learning its strengths, by exploiting its weaknesses. And it all began with one wrong turn over the English Channel. But the greatest irony remains. Germany spent months trying to capture a Spitfire intact, yet never succeeded. The British didn't have to try at all. Their enemy delivered his nation's most dangerous fighter straight into their hands. In the decades after World War II, aviation historians continued to revisit the story of the FW-190 that landed in Wales. Museums displayed surviving Focke-Wulfs as symbols of German engineering, but the captured aircraft, the one that touched down on RAF soil by mistake, earned a special place in military history. It had not fired a single shot in British skies, yet its impact on the war was immeasurable. Scholars came to agree. The intelligence extracted from that lone fighter reshaped the air war more profoundly than any single dogfight. The RAF preserved detailed notes, test reports, and performance charts created at Farnborough. These documents were studied by post-war designers in Britain, America, and even France. Jet age engineers marveled at how the FW-190 balanced firepower, ruggedness, and responsiveness, a trifecta that influenced the design philosophy of early Cold War fighters. Some features, like intuitive cockpit ergonomics and concentrated weapons placement, echoed in aircraft that would appear decades later. In Germany, the story was remembered with a mix of frustration and awe. Luftwaffe veterans acknowledged that the Allies' sudden shift in tactics in late 1942 felt almost supernatural, as if someone had whispered their secrets to the enemy. They didn't know, at the time, that their own pilot had inadvertently handed those secrets over. Only after the war did German officers learn the truth. The Allies had gotten everything they needed from one perfect condition FW-190 delivered straight to their airfield, no sabotage required. For pilots who survived the war thanks to the intelligence gathered from the captured aircraft, the legacy was personal. Many wrote in memoirs that the FW-190 briefings saved their lives. Others described the relief that came from finally understanding why the early encounters had felt hopeless. The war produced countless tragedies, but here was a rare moment where a single mistake, one brief lapse in orientation, had spared lives on the opposing side. Today, the story stands as a reminder of something deeper than aircraft performance or tactical doctrine. It speaks to the fragility of technological supremacy, the razor-thin margin between dominance and vulnerability. One pilot's momentary confusion changed the fate of aircraft design, altered the path of aerial warfare, and saved thousands of men who would have otherwise flown into the teeth of an unstudied enemy. In the vast machinery of war, it is easy to overlook the small moments. But sometimes, history turns not on grand battles or heroic charges, but on a single landing that should never have happened. And so the legacy of Armin Faber's mistake endures, not as a footnote, but as proof that in war, knowledge can be more decisive than firepower. The FW-190's accidental landing didn't just reveal an enemy's secrets. It rebalanced the skies.